She stared at her light switch without blinking, waiting for sleep to come. After the day she had, she wondered if sleep would come at all. How many times had she thought about turning it off? About turning them all off? Wondering if maybe it would help. If maybe it was all in her head. And facing the dark would just make it all stop. It seemed so logical. But it had been tried before. Spokane, Washington, 20 years earlier. "Please, Mom, don't let them put me in there. It's dark in there. That's when they come, is in the dark," Frankie pleaded with her mom, who simply stood there, holding her hand. "Frankie, honey, that's why we need to do it. So you'll see, sweetie, there's nothing in the dark to be afraid of. It's all bad dreams, baby, you'll see." Frankie turned to the nurses, blacking the windows of a very small room recently used for storage. Dr. Anderson had it cleaned out strictly for this experiment, convinced that if she was forced to face her greatest fear, she would no longer fear it. She looked up at her mother, who stood with a blank expression, just watching and holding Frankie's hand. "Mommy," she pleaded. But her mother said nothing. The room was small, with a glass door that opened from the outside. One of the nurses was taking special care to hang a giant sheet of black plastic over it, covering every possible inch that light could come through. She noticed Frankie watching and gave her a sweet, comforting smile. Frankie hated her then. The other nurse was just finishing with the windows. Not a sliver of light shone through them now, and she was beginning to panic again. The only light in the room now was coming from the waiting room they sat in as the door hung open, waiting for the smiling nurse to finish. Dr. Anderson emerged from his office a few feet away and offered them a seat across from him as he sat in a brown sofa. Her mother accepted and took a seat across from him. "Okay, Frankie, here's what we're going to do, kiddo," he started in his most kid-friendly tone. "We're going to start you off with something super easy. Today, I want you to be really, really brave for me. I need you to sit in that room for just 2 minutes. 2 whole minutes. Can you do that for me?" Frankie looked back at the room as the nurse finally finished the door. "It's dark." "Yeah, I know. But look at it this way. Whenever you're all done with your 2 minutes, you won't have to go back in today, and you'll get to pick out a very special toy to take home," Anderson said, raising his eyebrows as though what he said was exciting enough to undertake this venture. She looked at the room again, still clutching her mother's hand. "It's okay, honey," her mother said, as she gave her hand a comforting squeeze. She looked at Dr. Anderson and nodded her head, knowing full well it wouldn't take 2 minutes for her to regret it. "Good girl, Frankie. I'm very proud of you," Anderson said. Her mother just smiled and turned her attention to the door as he began to speak. "Now what's going to happen is today we'll do 2 minutes. Then next week we'll try 4. And then 8. And so on until we reach an hour. By that time, she should be able to handle the dark well enough on her own." He sounded so certain as he said it, and Frankie wanted to scream. She felt like no one had listened to her at all, ever. Things like shouting or banging and trying to get out should be expected, especially the first time, but no matter what, it's important not to panic. It's important to remember that it's only a couple of minutes, and it is crucial that she overcome her fear, he explained to her mother. She simply nodded and squeezed Frankie's hand. More and more, Frankie hated the sound of this. It looked bad enough. Did he really need to explain any more? Dr. Anderson gestured them to wait and disappeared into his office. When he came back, he was holding a white lamb with a red bow around his neck. "I thought since your green bear had gotten lost, maybe you'd like this guy." It was almost a question as he handed it to her. "See? He's kind of scared of the dark too. So maybe you two could do this together. I'm sure he'd like that. What do you think?" She clutched the lamb to her chest and nodded. "Thank you," she said softly. "You're welcome, Frankie. What's his name?" Anderson said gently as he pinched her nose. Frankie grinned and stared intently at her new friend. Thinking deeply. Yummy, she said with conviction, and nodded. Anderson smiled broadly. What do you say we go ahead and get this over with? He asked her encouragingly. Again, she nodded. He gave her a slight smile and took her hand, leading her to the black room. It was the longest short walk she had ever taken. A few short, simple steps had turned into miles of lava and hot coals. The closer they came, the more panic overtook her, the more she fought the urge to cry, the more she wanted to run. He stopped just short and knelt down to face her. Now, if you start to get super scared, just hug the bear really tight. Because remember, Frankie, he's scared too, just like you are, okay? It would really make Yummy feel better, I think, to know that you're here to keep him safe. He was trying to comfort her. He could see on her face that she was nearly frozen with fear, and maybe he was afraid for her. He sympathized with the child. In some way, she reminded him of himself at that age. He didn't have to tell her twice as she hugged the toy so tight to her chest, he thought its head might come off. Don't worry, Sunshine. Don't worry, Sunshine. We're going to be right here outside this door. So no matter what, it's going to be all right. Me and your mom will be right here, he said softly. Frankie just nodded and looked at her mother, her eyes wide and terrified as though pleading with her one final time not to make her do this. 2 minutes. Anderson gestured to her, pursing his lips and nodding, as though to say, she were tougher than she thought. Frankie hugged the lamb under her chin, pinched her eyes shut tight, and stepped into the room, listening to the door close behind her. Dr. Anderson took his seat back on the couch across from Frankie's mother. Immediately after the door had closed, the girl's breathing had become heavy and rapid. She was beginning to sob and panic, and they could hear her. The small, helpless whimpers of a terrified child, so convinced something was there to get her, echoed uncomfortably. Things like this take time, Mrs. Welsh. Time to get used to the idea that what she's scared of just isn't there. As a child, her little mind can come up with things that you and I couldn't even imagine. And for someone so young, hers is very, very active. Frankie just needs to adapt and get used to the dark. He trailed off as the child began to scream, pleading to be let out of the blackness she felt so trapped in. It was beginning to sound like someone was ripping the walls right out of the room. Scratching sounds like talons on concrete, and an indescribable thumping, as though the devil himself had a heartbeat resonating from the room. It startled even him. He began to wonder himself, irrationally of course, if perhaps her fears were real. Mrs. Welsh simply sat there, her hands folded and white-knuckled on her lap, her eyes shut tight and her lips drawn inward, listening to her child in the next room, wincing and jumping at each loud bang and high-pitched cry for help. Was this what happened at home when the lights went out, he wondered. Calm down, Frankie, sweetie. Just one more minute, kiddo, I promise, Anderson yelled to the closed door. The banging, scratching, and screams were becoming so loud that he was unsure if she even heard him. Even he was having great difficulty just sitting there, allowing this to go on. It sounded like she was being thrown about the room like a rag doll, and as though furniture that wasn't even there was beginning to be thrown into the walls and ripped to splinters. He wanted to run in there, pick her up and hold her, and tell her it was all over. And she didn't have to be afraid anymore. But ethically and logically, he couldn't do that. The nurses that had blackened the room came from behind their counter, wide-eyed and afraid, their hands covering their mouths, listening to the terror coming from within. They turned their gaze to the doctor, as though to say, do something. He just shook his head at them, and looked at his watch, hoping the time was up. Close enough. With 15 seconds left to go, he stood up and jogged toward the door. Without warning, it exploded outward, hurling the child into the waiting room, so hard that she hit the front of the sofa and rolled towards her mother. Anderson was knocked to the ground from the force at which Frankie was thrown. Screams erupted from nurses and mother alike, all rushing to see if she was alive. Anderson stared in horror at the room she was in. The walls were shredded to ribbons, from top to bottom, every inch. The floor was black and smeared with blood, and carpet had been clawed and ripped up in several places. Even the ceiling sported the same damage as the walls and floor. How could a child do this in less than 2 minutes? "Doctor!" a nurse screamed from across the room. Anderson wasted no time in leaping over furniture to the child's side, praying to whatever god might listen that she was still alive. Anderson was taken aback by what he saw. Frankie's face, chest, back, and arms were clawed to bits. Her left arm was obviously broken, and she was banged up and bruised almost beyond recognition. Anderson found a pulse, a very weak pulse. "Call 911, he screamed, so loud that he could swear it was someone else saying it. The nurses both rushed for the counter to get to the phone. Frankie's mother knelt on the ground, holding her unconscious child, rocking and sobbing with a confused, bewildered, and terrified expression. Anderson stood firm, though, terrified for the girl. And he held his emotions well in check, until he realized that Frankie was still holding the stuffed animal. It was ages ago, it seemed, but she never got over it. She had never been in a dark space again. She tore her gaze from the light switch and turned over on her side, tossing her leg out of the blanket. She took hold of Yami, smiling at all they had gone through together over the years. She kissed his nose, hugged him tight to her chest, and began her nightly battle for sleep.